Welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder. Barnaby's is one of the leading search engines for art, design, antiques and collectibles from over 3,000 auction houses worldwide. We aim to make the art and auction market more transparent and accessible to everyone, from beginners to collectors and professionals. Welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder, Emma. You are a climate activist and a spokesperson for Just Stop Oil. Just Stop Oil has attracted a lot of attention in recent months, not least in the art world, when several of your members have thrown paint or soup at some of the world's most famous works of art, and then have, or tried to, glue themselves to the work of art. My first question is, why targeting art and not, for example, the gates of a headquarters for the oil companies?
Well, I'd ask you, why not? Because the climate breakdown is going to affect every aspect of life and every single one of us. Obviously, there are corporate interests that are more to blame. But the interesting thing is that we did actually target oil companies. We targeted the 10 most important pieces of oil infrastructure in the UK and the south of England in April, and that didn't break through at all. And I think it's interesting. It's almost like we would expect climate activists to blockade an oil terminal, so it's not news. And what we're really doing right now is trying to get our demand to every member of the public and to the government, which is the no new oil licenses, because it's not anymore about trying to blockade the infrastructure. It's about trying to stop those decisions being made to invest in that infrastructure in the first place.
So it has been obviously quite successful then, since it has been covered by media all over the world, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think that we've been quite surprised because we use a diversity of tactics. So some things are more disruptive. Some things are, targeting the oil and gas industry. Some things are targeting kind of key infrastructure to put pressure on the government. And other things are more media focused. So things that are trying to get the message of the campaign out there, because we don't have time to spend years and years and years just doing stalls. We don't have the money of the oil and gas giants. In order to get the coverage, you have to do high profile actions. So that one's really taken off. And
how do you choose the works of art you use to send your message through? For example, Van Gogh sunflowers in particular, and not, as far as I know, for example, contemporary art or other kind of art.
It's a mixture. When we started off doing the art actions was in the summer, and that was when we glued ourselves to the frame of the paintings. And in those ones, we did kind of pick paintings that had like a cultural resonance and that were depicting landscapes because of the changing nature of the climate and the fact that these landscapes are kind of going to be irreversibly changed and destroyed. So in Scotland, where I live, we chose the painting "My Heart is in the Highlands," because we wanted to link to the Highland clearances and the idea that there are these interests that are making profit and are destroying the resources that really should belong to all of the people in terms of the basic necessities that we need to survive and live our lives. So we picked that one in particular so that we could use that message. Other ones like the Van Gogh sunflowers, I think partly we did originally want to do the soup on the Warhol. I can't remember what for reason that wasn't possible. But part of the targeting of is because they're so famous. That's also part of it. And it's interesting with the art, like I studied art myself, and it's been interesting hearing the different perspectives and the different analyses and the different opinion pieces, because artists love to kind of discuss why and like what the meaning, what the resonance is. And that's interesting. But at the end of the day, it is because something so kind of unartistic and uncreative, like the issuing of oil licenses, actually affects something so beautiful and so precious as our living environment, as even the societies that we have to be able to go and see precious works of art, they're not going to exist unless we tackle this existential threat.
And you yourself, as you said, you are an artist and a librarian. Doesn't it hurt to sabotage work of art like these famous and significant paintings by artists who are considered by the greatest of the time?
It's interesting you use the word sabotage, because actually, at the moment, no works of art have been harmed in these protests. Like, each painting had a pane of glass over it. There's been some kind of minor damage to the frame, which I think is proportional. And there's a long history of artworks being used to further like social and political campaigns. Obviously, one of the most famous ones being the suffragettes. And the person that, hacked the Venus, they got 6 months in prison. If we were to do that now, we'd be facing probably more than 10 years. The consequences are so much larger now. Anyway, that wasn't what the question was. But no, I worked in a library, and one of the students gave me a flyer to invite me to come to a talk to join this campaign. And I thought there is a very bizarre cognitive dissonance that we're all living in, where we're going about our daily life, like, for example, my job in a library, and we're protecting this knowledge, we're protecting these objects for a future that these young people, or like all of us, don't currently have. We're facing a future of food shortages and water shortages, and we're in, there's 70% of species have gone extinct in the last 50 years. There's a weird irony in the fact that we're so concerned about protecting these objects, protecting this cultural value, while we're prepared to watch entire nations become desertified or go underwater. That is the real loss of culture. So for me, there was a kind of tension that I felt within myself about the things that I claim to value and the things that I claim to think are important, and the fact that I was ignoring, because it's difficult, this thing that is going to threaten, our everything, including our ability to access these important cultural, pieces of information and artworks.
But I mean, what is your actual goal, and whom you are reaching out to primarily when doing those kind of actions?
Yeah, so the goal is really simple. So we're demanding that the UK government stop licensing new fossil fuel projects, which is just ridiculous. It's 2022 and we're seeing, the effects of the climate crisis all over the globe, including here in the UK. And it's something that the International Energy Agency, the UN, 99% of the world's leading climate scientists, our own government's climate change committee, our own government's scientific advisors, all of them are saying that we shouldn't be licensing new projects. It's something that every country in the world needs to do. So we need to start somewhere. So we're demanding that basic kind of cut-off point. And that will give us 8 years to transition and to make these rapid changes that we need to make. I'm 30 years old. I remember being told about this at school 20 years ago. And I'm like, and they're still talking about slowly. Oh, we can't do it fast enough. So that's the demand that we're making. And we're using a variety of tactics to put pressure on the government. And it does work. I mean, I'm interested to see, they haven't issued a new oil project since Jackdaw, which was in June. And our campaign has ramped up now. And last week I was on Country File, which is a really, mainstream British program about the countryside. And they're doing an 11-minute segment on, is the UK government bankrolling climate change by issuing these new licenses? So it is working. That's the thing about social change. It's the thing about protest. It's messy. It's not like things are going to change without things changing or without people being disrupted. That is how things do change. And I myself, one of the reasons I'm doing this is I think it's so important that something happens than nothing. Because I think it's bizarre the scale of the threat to us and the lack of action that we're seeing.
I mean, already around 50 years ago, scientists warned the UN of coming disaster. Now we're even closer, and according to many beyond rescue, and many activists call themselves the last generation or ultimo generazione. From your action, I see the desperation, and we see every day how we're massacring our planet in a completely merciless way. But if you had the ears of the worst decision makers pointed in your direction now, what is your main message that you want to get out?
I think I wouldn't bother, honestly, Pontus. My message is to the people, because we can't look at these politicians as some kind of paternalistic force that is going to save us. Only we are going to save ourselves. There's something my uncle told me the other day, that there's no justice, there's just us. And that is really what we need. We need, as people, to do everything we can. And that means challenging our institutions, challenging our financial investments, challenging our lawmakers. Because we've seen from 27 years of COP conferences that, that obviously international cooperation is important, but we need to be holding our own governments to account. And that means kind of facing this existential threat and being like, well, you know what? I can't control the weather, but what I can control and what I can have influence on is my government and my society. And so I think it's an interesting point when we ask, like, will decision makers, listen? And they're not going to listen without pressure. Almost everything that people have fought for throughout history, they've won by putting pressure on. So my message to them is obviously stop licensing new oil and gas projects and get on with the job. But we're going to be fighting this every step of the way until we reach some kind of social tipping point where it becomes socially unacceptable to do the things that they're doing. I was reading the North Sea oil transition report, and they were talking about how many oil projects and new licenses and exploration they predicted doing in the next sort of 10, 20 years. And they really said that it was down to whether they had the social authority, whether it was socially acceptable for them to carry on. That was one of the determining factors in whether they expanded or reduced, one of the main factors on whether they predicted the expansion or the reduction of the fossil fuel industry. So that shows us how important we are as citizens to this. It's the pressure that we create that will change things. It's not Rishi Sunak. He's going to be a barrier. It's going to be us that kind of creates the pressure for change.
When you and other climate activists participate in interviews in media, I get the impression that there is often an aggression towards you. At the same time, it seems that politicians and decision makers finally seem to be listening. So what is your next step? Will you continue with the art campaigns? Will this be a peaceful fight, or will this escalate?
The organization's aim, and my personal morality as well, is that it will always be not non-violent civil disobedience. But for me, non-violence is towards people. So there's 7 women that have been found guilty of breaking Barclays windows. I would count that as non-violence. It was done in a non-violent way, and it's drawing attention to it. It's not harming anyone. So that would be my line of what I think is morally justified, and also what is more likely to be successful. Because this isn't the first activism around environmental issues. People have been doing this stuff for years, of varying levels of destruction and peacefulness, and nothing so far has worked, unfortunately. But I think we're at an interesting time now, because the majority of the public are aware of the problem, and we can see the issue actually happening. And there's a bizarre, but maybe predictable response from the state, which is to punish us increasingly harshly, and to wage a kind of bizarre media kind of campaign trying to separate us from people and make us out to be eco-loons or, extremists. We'll keep going. We'll keep going because we don't have an alternative but to keep going. We'll try new things. We'll keep up the pressure, but it will always be non-violent. We'll never be attacking people or hurting people. We'll just have to keep going and hope that we reach that point where it's seen as strange for them to be talking about themselves as climate leaders while locking up peaceful protesters. yeah, that's what I hope we reach that stage for myself as well.
When will you know that you have achieved your goal and you can stop protesting?
So like our line is that we'll stop when the government issues a meaningful statement that they will halt all new licensing and consents for fossil fuels. So that's the kind of hard end of when we're when we'll stop protesting because we've achieved our goal. But I think really change is more messy than that. And I think it's important for the public to understand the kind of more convoluted way that protest is effective and that direct action works. So, for example, now we're in a position where even though the Labour Party, the party of opposition, is saying that they would lock us all up, for years, they have basically adopted our policy, which is that they would not issue any new oil and gas licenses. So, and they've obviously felt comfortable to do that because they think it's an election winner. So when I first was starting this campaign back in, when I joined in March, April, I didn't even know what the oil licenses were or that there were any going through. So we've massively raised the profile of this issue. We've made it very difficult for the government actually to approve any new oil fields. I'll be really interested to see the reaction if they do, because previously with Jackdaw, they just approved it the night before the Queen's Jubilee bank holidays, and it kind of just went through without really a whisper from anybody. But now, if that happens, they will be looking at us, expecting us to react. The news organizations will be speaking to us, speaking to government ministers, and it's becoming increasingly hard for them to justify. So I think we won't know the effect actually for maybe even years to come. It's much easier to look back and to see the effect that you've had than to know at the time. And I always compare this, I've said this in a few interviews, but I like this analogy of the system that we currently have, the one that's kind of feels impossible to change, is like a brick wall. And we're there throwing stones at this brick wall, and we don't know which is the stone that is actually going to break through, but we have to just keep trying. And so that's the analogy that I would make. And I think it's important that we keep trying, whether or not we know it's going to succeed. We have to keep trying because what we have is too valuable, too beautiful, and too precious to lose.
Back to the art again. Aren't you afraid that it will be counterproductive when using art since it's so sensitive for people? Do you understand what I mean?
Definitely. But actually, if you look at social movements throughout history, you don't get anywhere by being too softly, being outrageous. Even, some of the gay rights groups, one of them was literally called Outrage. That is actually the way that you change, move the social window, is because in some ways actually creating tension. Martin Luther King talks about this as well, like you need to create tension. Non-violent, you need to create confrontation emotionally for people in order to connect somehow emotionally to what's happening. Otherwise, they just don't care, really. It doesn't cut through to people. And I've seen, particularly with the soup action, which I'm as surprised as everybody else that this is the thing that has taken off worldwide. But I've found it interesting seeing the development of the commentary about that. So it started off being like, what is this? This is counterproductive. This will put everybody off. Everyone will now want to die of climate change because they're annoyed with the Just Stop Oil. And then I've seen kind of the evolution of thinking around it. And the question now is not, is climate change real? I mean, that's everyone, well, not everybody, but most people agree that. The question is also not, what do we need to do about it? We know what we need to do about it. The question is not even now, do we need to protest? Everybody agrees with that. Now there's this question of what is the right way to protest? And I think people are kind of starting to understand. Maybe they'll try writing to their MP and going on a march and seeing that does absolutely nothing. And that, yes, I do honestly think that initial outrage is quite useful because it connects to people emotionally and then it allows something else to happen afterwards. Whereas if we were just allowed to go along our daily business, not being upset, not being outraged, not being confronted, not being challenged in any way, then things are not going to change. So I think I think it's actually been surprisingly successful, that one.
But can you understand any of the criticism that you also receive?
I can understand it. I think it's interesting. On the one hand, I think people need to think, what do they expect us to do as protesters or as activists, you know? With that one in particular, like one of the main criticisms I saw was like, well, throwing soup at painting, that's not shutting down the oil industry. It's like, well, we were trying to do that and you didn't come with us in April. So if you would like to come with us and we can get 10,000 people to do that, then we can shut down the oil industry. But the point of actions, that there's many different points. And the point of that one was to cut through with our message. And how many millions upon millions upon millions of conversations has that sparked? How many platforms has that given us? And if even a small proportion of those end up talking about the real issues, then that's a success. And as you say, we're at a point now where we can't afford to be too cautious and too meek, because we know that we have a very limited amount of time to stop these climatic tipping points. And I would rather look back in a few years and, you know, I think we need to be afraid of doing too little, not too much. And especially when those paintings weren't even damaged. I think that is really encouraging people to think about what they consider too much, you know, when we're facing the deaths of a lot of people. Actually, it's kind of a human rights issue, really.
But did you know, when you say they weren't damaged, the artworks, did you know that before doing the action? Were you choosing them because they had glass in front of the canvases, etc.?
Definitely, yeah. We would always go and like look at the artworks. We even have conservators that we speak to ask them about, you know, potential damage and potential consequences. And we knew that those extremely famous ones were protected by like panes of glass.
You throw soup on one of the paintings. Was that a kind of analogy to the Andy Warhol painting, or?
Oh yeah, so the reason why we used soup was partly because of the orange color. Like, we wanted to make that kind of quite dramatic visual, and orange is kind of our trademark color. And we also wanted to make the link between the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis, because obviously people are really struggling to pay their energy bills, and that's plunging millions of people into fuel poverty. So we really wanted to try and get that. This is not just about the climate catastrophe, it's also about providing like affordable energy for everyone. So that was one reason why we used that, because there's people going to food banks that are asking not to have tinned goods because they can't afford the energy to heat the soup. So it's like we can't afford new oil and gas, and it's also destroying our planet. So we used it for that reason, and we were thinking about doing the Andy Warhol painting. I can't remember, there was a reason why we couldn't do it. But there was, I think there's something about it that's like a bit bizarre, but kind of intriguing about it. I think it's like the sunflowers and the soup. Sometimes there are these actions that are just kind of bizarre, and that helps somehow, as I was talking about earlier, it kind of helps the reach of the protest because it seems so odd, and also seems slightly funny, you know, and slightly, bizarre. So I think sometimes that can actually help the protest, like similarly like Caking the King as well.
So several museums have jointly come out and asked you to stop attacking works of art, and specifically museums that feel unfairly singled out, and they must restore any paintings and frames that are damaged in connection with your actions. Will you stop? Will you listen to them and stop doing this kind of actions?
No, we won't stop, because the problem hasn't been solved, and we need to use every tactic that we have. And, you know, Van Gogh died penniless. You know, these artworks are making a lot of, these artworks are on display to the public, which is brilliant. But the art world in general has, you know, made a lot of money out of a lot of poor people over its time, you know, in terms of, the art market is one way of kind of controlling wealth and hoarding wealth. And I think just as much as these artworks in especially national museums and galleries are owned for the benefit of the public, like we as citizens and as protesters are using the history, the culture, the significance and the value of those paintings to try and improve the lives of people now. And I don't think that's anything to apologize for, to be honest. I think we have as much right to the cultural value and significance of those paintings, especially in our aim, which is actually to protect life. And, you know, a lot of artists were socially progressive and quite outrageous figures in their time. So we have as much right to that cultural value as the institutions that are holding those paintings.
But does that mean that it's also governmental owned museums, or how do you say, stately owned museum? Or or will you also start to do this against like private owned museums, etc.?
We don't have a particular kind of, I think it's interesting. Obviously, this is more like a podcast kind of interested in that sort of sphere of culture. But this is just one of a diversity of tactics. We don't have a specific plan of, you know, we're not going after all of the artworks in the country. That's not the plan. The plan is what can we do strategically to make an impact, especially when, as usually happens, you know, after COP27, the climate crisis suddenly drops down everyone's agenda until the next horrific climate story. So, you know, we use these things strategically to get focus back on the issue, and that's usually So it's not that we're kind of have this sort of grand strategy plan of artworks that we want to interfere with in various collections, but it's something that we think is important to keep in our toolbox of protests, because for some reason, because art matters to people, because it touches something inside us, it's valuable in gaining media attention and also trying to connect people emotionally to what's happening. Because I just find it bizarre, really. I mean, I feel it myself, but it is bizarre culturally that we're more upset about that than we are with like half of Pakistan being underwater.
I think we all will follow your next step very carefully, and I hope that we will come to an end where the situation is so much better, and that you don't have to do this action against the museums and the artworks anymore. So in that sense, I wish us all good luck. To keep up with the latest trends and receive weekly updates on the art and auction world, subscribe to our newsletter on barnabys.com or read Barnabys magazine online.